My name is Seakga Tladi. This is what our program sounds like today. Now, this is the show where we engage the ideas, the histories, and the power struggles that are shaping our continent. And we do this from a grounded Pan-African perspective. And on this show, I want to bring you two important conversations once more. So, in our first story, we're going to be speaking about rural South Africa. We're going to be speaking about traditional South Africa and traditional leadership in South Africa. And right here, a new initiative is attempting to rethink how investment reaches traditional communities. As the Royal Authority for Commerce and Charters introduces a structured framework to connect businesses with projects that are led by traditional leadership, we are asking the question, how is it that we can bring investment into rural economies without disrupting the cultural and governance systems that sustain them? Can modern financial systems truly work alongside traditional authority? And what does it mean to build development models that are led from within the communities themselves? And to help me have this conversation and answer some of these questions, I've invited Nicolaas van Wyk onto the show. Nicolaas van Wyk is the Chief Executive Officer of the Chartered Institute for Business Accountants. Then, in our second story, we're going to be shifting to the global stage and shifting to a story that is still incredibly important for the global south, for the entire world, for justice in the entire world. We're going to be shifting to a story where history, politics, and protest collide. So, on the 17th of April, activists are going to be gathering once again outside the United States consulate in Sandton. And they're gathering in solidarity with Cuba, marking the anniversary of the Bay of Pigs invasion. If you know nothing about the Bay of Pigs invasion, then you have to stay tuned into the show. You're going to be learning quite a lot. And we're going to be raising urgent questions. Why does a Cold War era invasion still resonate in today's political climate? Something from more than 60 years ago. Why? Why does this still resonate in our political climate today? Also, what does solidarity look like in a world that is increasingly shaped by ongoing conflict? From Cuba to Palestine to Iran to Venezuela. And how do we understand the role of global power in shaping the sovereignty of nations? Now, joining me for this conversation is Professor Salim Vally, and he is one of the organizers of this protest that is going to be taking place on the 17th of April. These are two very different stories, but two very important conversations. Stay with us right here. Let's get it going. Let's talk about a part of the South African and the African economy that does get spoken about, or maybe not so much, but there are conversations about it. But it's rarely fully integrated into mainstream monetary investment economic systems. And this is rural communities or traditional communities. Throughout this show, you'll hear me use these words interchangeably. Those who want to protest and argue about the definitions, I concede. I am using them interchangeably at the expense of perhaps being wrong. So please understand what I'm saying. When I'm saying rural communities and traditional communities, I mean the same thing. Because across South Africa, millions of people, according to Mr. Nicolaas van Wyk, almost 18 million people live under traditional leadership structures. Communities with rich cultural heritage, very strong systems of authority, and very ingrained systems of social cohesion. But when it comes to economic development, many of these communities remain on the margins. So the question is, how do you unlock investment in rural economies, in traditional economies, without undermining the authority, the culture, and the governance systems that already exist within these communities, and Also, quite importantly, what would it look like? What would a model look like where development is not imposed from the outside, but it's driven in partnership with traditional leadership? And we're going to be exploring a new initiative that's attempting to do exactly that. At the center of this conversation, what we're talking about is the Royal Authority for Commerce and Charters. I'm going to be calling this the RACC because there's no ways I'm going to keep saying the Royal Authority for Commerce and Charters over and over again. But the RACC is an emerging platform that's designed to create structured and credible pathways for investment into rural economies, into traditional economies. Economies that are traditionally governed. At the base of this idea is a very, very simple style of thinking, but one that's powerful, right? And the idea is to bridge the gap between traditional leadership structures, which are very, very established in South Africa and in many parts of Africa, to bridge the gap between them and modern economic systems. So the RACC does this by introducing a framework that helps rural development projects meet governance, compliance, and accountability standards that investors require. So when an investor, is looking to begin a project somewhere, when an investor is looking for somewhere to put their money, there's certain things that they look for. There's certain boxes that must be checked. And the RACC is a mechanism that guarantees for the investor and for the traditional community that those boxes are checked and facilitates the exchange of money in some ways. Because one of the biggest challenges facing rural investment is not lack of opportunity, it's not lack of ideas, it's not lack of human capital. There's plenty. I just said up to 18 million people are living under traditional leadership. Assets are there, minerals are there, land is there. Sometimes what's not there is structure. And this makes investors hesitate because the systems of governance are unclear, compliance mechanisms are not standardized, and sometimes risk can be difficult to assess. So the RACC steps into the space by providing a framework that is able to certify the investment projects that this is viable. They can certify this credibility, which comes from the Chartered Institute for Business Accountants. These accountants are the ones that make sure that if they say that, yes, we certify that this project, you can put your money here, then they borrow the credibility of that body. It also provides governance support in some ways. And for me, the biggest thing is that this RACC instilled a sort of respect into traditional leadership that is there for citizens and people who live in those communities. But often investors from outside don't really have that, the credence. They don't believe in the credence of traditional African leaders. They'd rather deal with the political types. This is where the RACC is stepping into. This allows businesses to participate in development initiatives that are led by traditional authorities themselves, while at the same time still meeting modern financial and regulatory expectations. So in essence, what we can see here with the RACC is a bridge between two worlds that have struggled to connect historically. Now, to understand why this matters, we have to zoom out. We have to look at the broader picture. As always, South Africa's rural economies are full of untapped potential. I touched on it briefly now. Think about the land, the acres and acres of traditional land that's got so much potential. It's brimming with potential. There could be minerals under there. And because the traditional communities might not necessarily have the money for exploration or whatever, that mineral wealth is not extracted and used. There's potential for cultural tourism. Everybody, or not everybody, a lot of people who come to South Africa, they want to see that whole stereotypical African thing. And that's where the cultural tourism comes in. You can go see absolutely excellent and interesting African cultures. There's potential for agriculture, which comes from the land, of course, and also local enterprise. There can be many businesses that get started in these traditional economies. So I will say again, South Africa's traditional and rural economies are full of untapped potential. But unlocking that potential requires more than just government money. There's a key that is needed. And one of these keys is trust. And trust in these communities is deeply tied to the traditional leadership. In South Africa, traditional leadership is very, very respected, at least by the people who live in those communities. I myself, one of my younger nephews, he's going to initiation school first, and he's got to go be introduced to the king, Ekosini. That's what they call it in Ndebele, Ekosini, by the home of the chief, Ekosini, or by the base of the chief. So in South Africa, traditional leadership is very, very respected and trusted by a lot of people. Institutions like the National House of Traditional Leaders remind us that these authorities that traditional leaders have, they're not just symbolic. They're not symbolic at all. They are actively participating in South African governance. The National House of Traditional Leaders mediates disputes. They see bills that come from Parliament. They go to the National House and they have a say. Traditional leaders oversee land allocation and they guide community development. They play a pivotal role in looking after millions and millions of people. And a lot of the time, they do so without access to strong funding. Yes, there's money. There's some money, of course. Money is needed to live, and they're living, so there must be some money. But there's not a strong framework for funding, which the RACC is now addressing that matter. For many South Africans, allegiance to kings and queens is not just cultural, it's political, it's social, and it's also deeply personal. This year, not so long ago, this year in 2026, there was a recent event surrounding the attempted coronation of an Igbo king in South Africa, which sparked widespread backlash. Now, I know that the story has been clarified in recent days, that it wasn't really a coronation, and I believe that the Igbo king that was crowned, I think he has since apologized, but don't quote me on that one, I'm not certain. The point is not whether there was a coronation that happened or not. We know that many South Africans believed that an Igbo king, Igbo is a group of people from Nigeria, and South Africans believed that they had coronated a king in South Africa. I think it was in the Eastern Cape. And this drove South Africans crazy. It drove South Africans crazy. I had conversations with people who said, how dare they? How dare they crown a king that is not a recognized South African king? What does that show us? That shows us that many South African people take their traditional leadership very, very seriously. They take the sovereignty of their traditional leadership very, very seriously. They take respect about the existing traditional systems that they have. They take respect for these systems incredibly seriously. This revealed that traditional leadership remains powerful and one of the pillars of South African society. So, because of how respected traditional leadership is, and also the sheer number of people living under traditional leadership, it can bring us to the conclusion that when you support traditional leadership structures, you're not just supporting governance, but you're supporting communities as well. So what makes this RACC model particularly interesting is that it doesn't try to replace or bypass the systems that are already there in South Africa. It doesn't try to replace or bypass the South African government, which provides money for recognized kings and things of that nature, but it works with them. So by recognizing the authority of traditional leaders and integrating them into formal economic frameworks, the RACC helps to reinforce their legitimacy, to preserve cultural structures, and to protect indigenous governance systems by empowering them with money. And this is critical in a time where globalization often threatens to erode local identities, where the hegemony of English and Western culture threatens to erode our local identities. I mean, listen to me right now. I'm speaking English with this, lovely accent of mine. And I'm a South African, born and bred. I should be speaking to you Sesotho or Zulu or Pitori. Polelo engwe lengwe, it doesn't matter, but here I am speaking in English because of, the power of English hegemony and Western hegemony, empowering these traditional leadership systems with money, with the ability to pursue whatever projects they can and to develop their communities, is a way to protect our cultures, our local identities. Development can't come at the loss or at the cost of culture. And culture is very, very deeply respected in these communities. In fact, isn't it that, and I'm asking a question now, but isn't it that the most sustainable development models are those that are rooted in local realities? So by embedding respect for traditional leadership into its framework, the RACC is not just facilitating investment, but it's contributing to the preservation of our cultures, our systems of knowledge, and that's a powerful thing. But the story doesn't end in South Africa. The RACC, according to my interview with Nicolaas van Wyk, they do have ambitions that extend across the African continent. The platform is already operational in Namibia, and there are plans to, expand further into other African countries. And this makes sense because, of course, traditional leadership is not exclusive or unique to South Africa. That's obvious. Across Africa, traditional communities continue to play a central role in governance. Traditional leadership continues to play a central role in governance. In many cases, they are the closest form of authority to some groups of people. They act as custodians of land and culture, and they are key players in local information systems and local development. So this means that the RACC model has the potential to be replicated across the continent. But more importantly, or very importantly, maybe not more importantly, it represents a shift in thinking. It represents a shift towards development models that are context specific, that are culturally grounded, and that are locally driven. This is something we've been advocating for as a BRICS bloc and as the Global South for a long time. Our development on our terms that fits our circumstances. This is what the RACC is doing at the small level of traditional leadership. In a continent as diverse as Africa, this approach is not just beneficial, but it's necessary. So as we reflect on this, there's something that becomes very clear. Our African development is not going to happen in the big cities alone, here in Johannesburg, in Cape Town, in Durban, in Pietermaritzburg, all these big cities. There is not so much traditional leadership structure there. But that is not all of our country. A big part of our country is the traditional communities that is under the guidance of traditional leaders who have governed their people for generations. The challenge is not whether, these systems should exist. They already do. The challenge is how to connect them to economic opportunities. The RACC model is doing it in an innovative way that you'll hear about right now from Nicolaas van Wyk. We need to connect traditional communities to money without losing what makes them unique, what makes them beautiful, what makes them conduits of our culture. And the RACC is one possible answer. A model that doesn't impose any of its standards, it collaborates. It doesn't replace any existing mechanisms, it strengthens them, it collaborates with them. And a model that recognizes that development is not only about growth, but it's about dignity and identity and culture and community. We develop all of these things at the same time. Now, I've had the opportunity to speak with someone who's deeply involved in this space. You've heard his name is Nicolaas van Wyk, and he is the CEO of the Chartered Institute for Business Accountants. The Chartered Institute for Business Accountants has partnered with ROLESA, the Royal Institute, some body for royals in South Africa. It's slipping my mind right now. But they've partnered to form what became the RACC. And in this conversation I'm about to have with Nicolaas van Wyk, we're going to explore how the RACC framework works in practice, what it means for investors and for these communities, and the broader implications of traditional development in South Africa and in Africa. So let's take a listen to that interview. First and foremost, can you briefly explain or introduce the Royal Authority for Commerce and Charters to our listeners and its mission to sort of connect traditional leadership with modern business practices as it prepares to launch in South Africa?
So at South Africa is and Africa has a very unique traditions and cultures, and sometimes the constitutions of an African state, but we're specifically speaking about South Africa and Namibia, makes provision for the recognition of traditional leaders. So, for example, in South Africa, we have the Traditional Leaders and Khoisan Act. We also currently are discussing in Parliament a customary law or customary courts act, and legislation passes through this house, the National House of Traditional Leaders, and to give their views and comments. And then we have vast kingdoms. We have about 13 officially recognized kings and chiefs and about 3,800 headmen, and they govern their traditional areas and land. And if you look at the number of people living in rural areas as subjects of these kings, it's about 18 million people, which is a huge area and a huge number of people living under traditional leadership. But this structure of governance is categorized by a lack of funding. So although government has provided for the structure and the policies, they really don't get any funding and support for running their communities. And also due to historical reasons, they also received lack of funding in the previous regime governing South Africa, so that there's limited infrastructure, limited coordination of development, and which makes the areas unfundable. If you would go to a funder, they want certain things in place, and that one would be security of their own funds and whether the product will actually deliver an ROI. And hence, as a professional body, the Chartered Institute of Business Accountants decided to join hands with one of the traditional leader groups in South Africa called ROLESA, the Royal Leaders of South Africa, and we formed a platform, a funding platform, and that platform is called RACC. It's the Royal Authority for Commerce and Charters, and it now enables the working class people and more affluent communities, and also not only local but also international, to make a contribution on this fund in the form of a monthly donation. And then with the involvement of SIBA, we do the financial management of this to make sure that any money collected and investments made are accounted for and transparently done. And then we have appointed a group of analysts and investors to decide which projects is most deserving of funding or will deliver the best results for local communities. And that spans over 3 pillars or 6 pillars, and that includes quite a few things. One, advocacy. So we need to make sure that when laws are drafted that affects traditional leaders, that they are done in a cultural sensitive manner. We also assist with land claims. There's still a lot of land areas that's held by the state that we believe should be transferred for the control of traditional leaders. And then there's local support functions. The 3,800 headmen that I mentioned, they are daily involved in maintaining the village, whether it's with governance or disputes or damage to property. They're involved with making that community better, but they don't get any funding from government. So this is a way that South Africans that have a job, that earn a salary, can make a contribution to their traditional areas in a very structured and governed way.
Yeah, that's incredibly interesting because I know that traditional leadership is incredibly important to many, many South Africans. And I know that there is great wealth within traditional communities, except the wealth is almost locked by a sort of mistrust and a lack of structure that it seems like the RACC is bringing. So that is incredibly interesting and I think incredibly important for South African communities and various South African people going forward. My next question is, what sort of structured framework does the RACC provide to make sure that rural economies and these traditional economies can be more attractive to private sector involvement?
So whenever you make plans for investments or consider a return on investment, you need to first do research. So one of the projects that the RACC will fund, for example, would be research into traditional areas. It's not always clear where their areas start and stop. It's not always clear what the exact economic needs are or what infrastructure needs are there, or how a new policy will affect them. So the RACC will fund a research division for the royal leaders of South Africa, so that when legislation is presented to them, that it can be properly analyzed and they can make meaningful contributions on the legislation. We want to make sure that each and every piece of legislation includes a section covering traditional areas, whether it's now the Companies Act or any other Properties Act or a Schools Act or whatever. We need to make sure that traditional leaders are recognized when it comes to the decision making, especially from municipalities and so forth. So the first point would be good research. And then the second one would be, how do we make this projects? And there's many, many projects. We've been really traveling a lot throughout the country, meeting with all, if not or most of the kings in South Africa, looking at the projects that they're busy with. And there's really amazing things happening, from food production to farming to infrastructure. And they're already running successfully. So we're not trying to reinvent anything. We're just trying to formalize it more and making it part of the mainstream economy. So we want to make their ideas and projects fundable. And that means appointing a qualified accountant. CIBA is the Chartered Institute of Business Accountants, and we're regulated by government with various regulators and agencies, and we understand finance and accounting and standards. And we bring this knowledge through our members. We're connecting professional accountants with the kings so that we can review their projects and make sure they're fundable. And also audit, we're going to audit the delivery of the services. And this gives comfort then to investors, whether it's the public giving general funding through donations, or whether it's a large successful business that want to invest in rural areas to make sure that their money is safe and that we can account for all the money that's spent.
Now, the RACC, according to my understanding, has got presence in several areas across South Africa, obviously because there will be chiefdoms and communities in different areas in South Africa, as well as in Namibia. And now I know that between every community, there's a little bit of nuances and differences, and definitely between the Namibian kingdoms and South African kingdoms, there will be differences. So my question is, how is it that the RACC can collaborate with traditional leaders in a way that helps the RACC to understand the cultural nuances and the community to support
Mm,
them in a way that is suitable for that
mm,
community?
mm. So RSIC, it was created by the founding partners, which is the Chartered Institute of Business Accountants, ourselves, as well as a organization called ROLESA, the Royal Leaders of South Africa. And they then formed this platform called RSIC. So RSIC itself isn't a representative entity. It doesn't speak on behalf of communities. It is a platform, a national platform, hopefully Africa-wide soon, that makes traditional leadership and kings attractive for people to want to fund. Because one, they trust this platform and they know where and how the money will be spent. What the communities then do with this money under the leadership of the kings is up for the various organizations. Most of the kings and the royalty form their own organizations like Rulesa, and they run by their own rules and requirements. They know what their communities need, and the only function of RSIC is therefore a conduit between the public and the business community, channeling then funds, obtaining funds, and then channeling them to the support of rural communities.
Now, I am someone who's very interested in the sort of geopolitics of the Southern African development community. And I've heard you saying that, you're hoping that this will be an Africa-wide initiative soon. So my question is, how does this model is there any way in which it can help to facilitate sort of interregional trade and become more of a regional body for the SADC region?
Hmm. So obviously, when you talk about Africa, there's different countries and states, and these countries and states have their own governing administration, and RSIC will work within the policies and framework set by government, whether it's South Africa or Namibia or any other African state. So in that sense, I suppose you could compare it to an international organization like the World Bank or funders. It's just that our funding doesn't come from other states.
Yeah.
We're sourcing the funding from the public and then from corporates. But in essence, it's a funding organization that receives funding and then makes sure that when that funding is distributed, it's done in an accountable and transparent way. So that's why it can work in South Africa and Namibia and also in the rest of Africa. And I think when you talk about SADC and those places, what's really lacking, even if you do a general Google search, you'll find very limited research about the actual needs and development focus areas of traditional leaders and what's actually happening there. So there's a lack of coordination, and we hope that through the funding that we'll be receiving from the public, then we can appoint researchers to properly map and provide an analysis of what's happening in traditional areas and what the real needs are. For example, there's many minerals accessible on the lands of traditional leaders, but they have no money for feasibility studies. They've got no money to prepare a prospectus and go and look for external funding. So the projects are never formalized. And hence, what it causes then is also extraction from big corporates that can move in and to harm the community and traditional leaders. So they need a very strong legal backing. They need very strong research, and they need a way to analyze what is the best partners to work with and which projects to fund. Now, at the moment, there's none of that. So it creates a little bit of uncertainty, a lot of uncertainty, sometimes chaos, and just a lack of development. So the purpose of RSIC is to source funding to provide this backbone for traditional leaders to be able to make informed decisions.
And I know, I'm almost certain that a lot of well-off people who show great appreciation to their communities that they come from and great appreciation to
Mm.
their royal leaders. I think they'll be keen in putting a bit of their money into this sort of thing. So, how can individuals and communities
Mm.
engage with the platform as it
Mm.
stands today?
Yeah. So the RSAC works in conjunction with what you just described. There are already a lot of wealthy individuals, millionaires, billionaires, already supporting their communities. Patrice Motsepe is, I think, the most famous example, and he's a well-known benefactor of traditional leaders and their areas. So this isn't replacing that. Individuals still contribute. Many people on weekends or on holidays go to their traditional areas and participate in the communities.
Yeah.
So the RICC is just going on a more national level instead of an individual level, sourcing funding, and it's small funding. It ranges from 50 Rand to 500 Rand a month. So our business model, if you will, is to obtain 1 million people contributing between 50 Rand to 500 Rand a month to funding the project. So it's not billionaires and millionaires already support their communities, but the broad middle class of South Africa would obviously want to participate in this platform is then facilitating that they can do so. The website is royalcharter.org. So people can go to the website, royalcharter.org, and that name is significant. We learned a lot from how in the previous centuries, Britain operated by chartering their companies. So you would go to the king or the queen back then, and you would obtain a charter, which means, and back then it was a legal license to trade. Now the world has changed. The British Empire is no more. But the concept of obtaining permission, even if it's just a symbolic permission, is still very relevant. So, especially in a capitalistic system, it can be very harsh and very the speculative within a community. And local communities can't compete with that kind of capitalism. So they need a backing, which is RSAC. And what we want to instill in businesses is that they still have a responsibility to the traditional communities, and some of them would want a way to demonstrate that. So we also developed something called the Royal Charter, which is like a cultural permission that you obtain from the local king or queen. So it's not a permission that you'll get from the state. We're not competing with the CIPC or the Registrar of Companies or any of that, because that is necessary for good order in any society. But what we do add to the existing legislation is a cultural respect that you would display to your local king or queen, and that is through a seal that we call the Royal Charter. So a business can add this to their product, and in that way, the 18 million consumers can see that this business that they want to trade with, or they can now select a business. If a business has this seal, they know that that business respects traditional communities and traditional values. So yeah, there's some form of commercial benefit in participating with our RSIC for big businesses. And then, as I explained, we have this million donators that we're looking for, middle-class people working that want to make a contribution of between 50 Rand to 500 Rand. And with that, we estimate we could get like 100 million Rand a month, which we then can allocate effectively through the partnership of SIBA and ROLESA into infrastructure development, research, and advocacy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of seeing two things here. Firstly, it's the great credence and respect that is granted to
Mm.
traditional leadership through the Royal
Yes.
Charter. At the same time, it seems like a great vehicle to make lay people, middle class people. I mean, even poorer people who can, put
Mm.
together that 50 Rand, make them feel as though they're contributing to
Exactly.
their community meaningfully. So yeah, that's incredibly interesting. My final question is, you know, I want to maybe end off in Africa and the African Union, because the African Union's agenda includes a sort of inclusive growth. So my final question is, how does this RACC position rural traditional leaders as key participants in continental development and development in
Mm,
their own communities as well?
mm, mm. Yeah, so I can use South Africa as an example, and I'm sure it works the same way in other African states. We have the National House of Parliament, then a Provincial House of Parliament, but we also have the National House of Traditional Leaders. Although it's not a legislative body, it can't issue legislation. If legislation is discussed in Parliament and proposed, it does go to the House, National House, for their input. The problem there is a lack of proper support from which they can analyze the legislation and how it affects them. And that's why we want to fund researchers, economists, and lawyers to properly scrutinize this legislation, so that the voice of the traditional leaders and their subjects are properly heard in the legislation. And that is also what we want to do with the African Union. There's amazing developments in the African Union for inter-Africa trade. If you consider what they're planning to do on infrastructure and connecting and free trade, it's just huge and amazing. But you need still to understand how your decisions is going to affect local people in rural areas. And I think this is where RACC can play a significant role by supporting the work of the AU with proper research for decision making.
Right, that was my interview with Nicolaas van Wyk, speaking about this new RACC framework, well, relatively new. We've learned a lot. We've learned about some of the problems that traditional leaders face in trying to develop their communities. And we've learned about the RACC as a potential solution. And we've also learned about the importance of our traditional leadership and the importance of supporting them through mechanisms like this. Now, I want to turn to Cuba. I want to turn to a crisis that is one of the defining crises. You know, we live in a world that has got like 3 or 4 defining crises. Like right now, our world is defined by violence and fighting. And in all of this violence and fighting, there's one party, there is one name that comes up almost every time. And almost every time, this one party, this one country, this one administration, they always position themselves as if they're right. But they're always the ones ending up in these conflicts. So let's talk about Cuba. There's a protest that's going to be taking place right here in South Africa on the 17th of April. And this is outside the consulate of the United States in Sandton. And this is a protest in solidarity with Cuba. But it's also much more than that, because Cuba is not the only struggle in the world. It's the Bay of Pigs invasion, memorial or the celebration, 60th anniversary. It's the anniversary of the Bay of Pigs invasion. So Cuba is centralized in this matter for sure. But it's not only about Cuba. It's about a long history of resistance against what we can only call American imperialism, what we can only call American bullying, what we can only call American disgusting sort of imposition of itself onto the world. That's what America tries to do. And that's why it's always at the center of these conflicts, even though it always positions itself as defending democracy or fighting against terrorism. They always defend themselves in some sort of elaborate way to manufacture consent. But the truth is, they're imperialists, they're bullies, they are trying to impose themselves and their will onto the world that is just trying to survive, that's just trying to get by, that is just trying to develop. That is all anyone else is trying to do. All Cuba has tried to do in its independence is, try to get by and form a state for themselves. They've also tried to help other states reach independence. We know that very well in Southern Africa. We'll talk about that just now. Iran, Palestine, everyone else is just trying to live. South Africa, for heaven's sakes. South Africa is just trying to run a normal state, and we are jabbed over and over again. We're punched, we are slapped, we are provoked over and over again by the United States, especially recently, especially under this latest buffoonish, stupid, unthinking administration. Everyone's trying to live a normal life, and then America must impose itself. They always find a reason to impose themselves. And that is what that is what activists are going to gather against outside the American consulate on April 17th, on the anniversary of the Bay of Pigs invasion, a moment in history where Cuba's sovereignty was directly violated. And it's still being violated to this day by this stupid blockade that we've got. So we need to ask ourselves, this failed invasion that took place 65 years ago, why does it still matter today? And why are activists in South Africa linking that history to current conflicts from Cuba, Palestine, Iran? So let's go back. Let's go back to 1959. This was one of my favorite things to learn about in history class. I loved learning about the Cuban Revolution, and then the Bay of Pigs invasion, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba's history is so interesting, and even before 1959, I'm pretty sure, I don't know much of Cuba's history before 1959, admittedly, but I'm sure there's a lot of interesting things to learn. Everyone should go and try to learn a little bit about Cuba, especially if you know nothing about it. It's great history. But in 1959, it was the year when Cuban revolutionaries, led by Fidel Castro, and also involving Che Guevara, the very famous, very handsome man whose face is on t-shirts, very famous t-shirts all over the world. And these Cuban revolutionaries overthrew a US-backed dictator, Fulgencio Batista. Fulgencio Batista, he was a repressive ruler in Cuba. He did not take care of his people very well, and his own people rebelled against him. They overthrew him. Batista was a puppet, an absolute puppet of American interests, presiding over a system that prioritized foreign capital while many Cubans lived in poverty. So his people come together and they overthrow him, and Castro comes to power. And Castro attempted something very radical. It shouldn't be so radical, but because America is so invested in protecting its own interests at the expense of anyone and everyone else, it is a lot more radical than it should be. And this radical thing that Cuba attempted, that Cuba is still trying to attempt now, you know what it is? It's simply independence. That's all Cuba did. That is all Cuba did to deserve the ire, the absolute, the might, to deserve the might of the American military, to deserve the anger and the ire of America. All they did to deserve it, you know what it was? Try to be independent. They tried to nationalize their own resources and use them for their own people. What a violation. Oh my goodness. No, the Americans can't stand that. A country is just trying to simply use its own resources for its own people? No, America can't accept that. Cuba simply tried to govern in the interest of Cubans, not in the interest of external powers. And what do they get for doing that thing? What do they get for trying to simply get by as a country? You know what they got? They got conflict. They started a rivalry with the United States by simply trying to exert their own independence. Because almost immediately, the relations between Cuba and America, they deteriorated. Economic pressure followed, diplomatic isolation followed, and then eventually, direct intervention. And this is part of a pattern, man. A pattern where attempts at independence, attempts at trying to get by and just be a country in the global south are often met with resistance from powerful external actors. This is the issue. A blatant lack of respect for sovereignty. We're just trying to do our own thing. We don't care what's going on in America. America is sovereign because no one else cares to attack the sovereignty of anyone else. But they do not respect sovereignty at all. They're leaders. And look, I am not speaking about the American people. There are plenty of great American people with great politics, plenty of people that are very against the abduction of President Maduro, plenty of Americans that are against the genocide in Palestine, plenty of Americans that are against the war in Iran, plenty of Americans that condemned Donald Trump when he threatened Iran with genocide. There's plenty of good American people. But these American administrations that we've seen, man, so incredibly evil. So incredibly evil, but so good at creating a story that makes their evil look justified. Well, at least the previous administrations did that. You know, under Obama and Biden, yes, they made their evil acts appear as though they're doing some sort of favor for someone else. But this current administration, they're blatant about it. They're like, yeah, we wanted the oil. We want oil from Venezuela, so we took their president. So on April 17, 1961, that tension, that disrespect of sovereignty by the Americans and the insistence on independence and sovereignty by the Cubans, it reached the breaking point. A force of Cuban exiles that was trained, funded, and supported by the United States, they launched an invasion of Cuba at a place known as the Bay of Pigs, and their objective was clear. They wanted to do to Castro what Castro did to Batista. They wanted to overthrow him. The invasion was coordinated by the CIA and approved under the administration of President John F. Kennedy. President John F. Kennedy, you know, who gets lauded for his work with civil rights in America. But we won't forget, we won't ignore that he approved the Bay of Pigs invasion. John F. Kennedy as well did not give a single damn about the sovereignty of Cubans, all the way in the 60s. But you know what followed? A dramatic failure. The Bay of Pigs invasion failed. It was within a few days, the Cubans defeated the invading group and captured a bunch of them as well. The invasion collapsed, but the significance of the invasion did not. Because the Bay of Pigs revealed, it revealed the extent to which powerful nations, America, is willing to intervene in the affairs of smaller states. It revealed the vulnerability of newly independent governments. And it showed the length to which sovereignty could be challenged. And here we are, 65 years later, and we're still grappling with the same bloody questions. We're still talking about the disrespect of Cuban sovereignty 65 years later. We're still looking at regime changes 65 years later. So the pattern continues. The pattern is continuing. Cuba remains under a long-standing economic blockade, one that is having significant impact on its economy and its people. I've got a friend who's studying medicine in Cuba because Cuba does very, very well at training doctors for the global south. Cuba has got a great medicine training system. They're great at medicine. That's what Cuba is trying to contribute to the world. And what do they get for it? They get a blockade. I need to make contact with my friend in Cuba to hear how he's doing because Cuban people are suffering, man. And it's not just in Cuba. Cuba's not alone. Across the world, we are seeing all of these flashpoints. Attacking Iran, genocide in Gaza. And feel free to argue and disagree, and we can have these conversations, but I put the charge of genocide on the United States almost as much as I put it on Israel. I put the charge of genocide on all of these countries that have supported Israel almost as much as I put it on Israel. We have situations like Venezuela still. These powers don't give a damn about anyone's sovereignty. These are not isolated issues. We can't look at them alone. They're connected. They're connected by a broader system of global powers where there's countries that can exert their influence over others through economic pressure, through military intervention, and through political interference. That's what they do. And this is what people are gathering to protest against on April 17th. They're seeking to highlight this. It's a call for international solidarity, a call to recognize that the struggles in one part of the world are often linked to the struggles elsewhere. And we need to change that. Now, for South Africa, for South Africans, my brothers and sisters at home in South Africa, we should be one of the angriest at the situation going on in Cuba. Because Cuba is not just, a distant factor in our politics. Cuba is a partner. Cuba has been a partner in our struggle. During the liberation movements in Southern Africa, particularly in Angola, Cuba played a significant role. Cuban forces supported anti-colonial and anti-apartheid struggles at a time when many African nations were fighting for their freedom. That history must not be forgotten. It needs to shape how Africa views Cuba today. Our brothers are over in Cuba suffering. Our brothers and sisters. Cuba is not just a country under pressure, but it's a country that stood with us in our own moment of need. So we need to take the call for solidarity seriously when activists call us. Because this is a shared history that they're invoking, a history of mutual support. So we come to the present moment. We come to this upcoming protest on April 17th. A protest in Sandton on a symbolic date. And a message that extends beyond one country. It's not just a message, it's a principle. The principle is that all nations, regardless of their size or power, have the right to determine their own future. It's a call for peace that they're calling for on the 17th. And also a call for accountability. Yes, a whole lot of accountability. Because we embolden the United States and her allies to act in this manner again when we don't hold them accountable. And real accountability. I don't know what it looks like yet. I don't know how the international community musters the power up together to be able to actually inflict actionable consequences on the United States and all nations that are violating international law. We need that mechanism. It should have been the UN, but the UN has a way of being toothless towards these things. So this is a call for all peace-loving people to stand against what is injustice, wherever it occurs. Because if history teaches us anything, it's this, that today it's one country, and then tomorrow it's yours. History doesn't disappear. It echoes over and over and over and over again. From the Bay of Pigs in 1961 to the streets of South Africa in Sandton in 2026, the question remains the same. Who has power? Who decides about things? And whose sovereignty is respected? And the answer here lies not only in government, but in people, in our collective action, in solidarity that crosses borders. Because in a world shaped by power, it's often solidarity that creates the possibility of change. We can't do anything alone, and we won't do anything alone. But together, we just might have something, man. We just might have something that might be able to stand up and say no more. No more blockade on Cuba for simply trying to get by as a country. No more invading countries and kidnapping their presidents. No more bombing nations. No more genociding populations. I can't believe I have to say that. I can't believe that's a reasonable thing for me to be calling for. That should be a no-brainer. Not for the Americans. Now, to help me unpack these issues further, I've spoken with someone who is deeply involved in organizing this protest that's going to be taking place on April 17th. Professor Salim Vally is a member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and he's part of the organizing team behind the Cuba Solidarity protest here in South Africa. And we had a pretty cool conversation. He was running out of time, so we couldn't have as long a conversation as we wanted, but I will definitely invite him back onto the show because I think we're still going to have a lot of conversations about Cuba. And hopefully we'll have a conversation about the Cuban blockade coming to an end and Cuba being able to be set free from the clutches of American attempted imperialism. So please help me welcome to the show Professor Salim Vally. We're marking almost the 65th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, and we've still got an incredibly dire geopolitical mess going on in Cuba right now. So I thought it very important for us to talk to you, especially with this protest that is coming up in solidarity with Cuba. So thank you for joining me. I want to get straight into it. So like I said, we're marking the 65th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs invasion, where the United States tried to invade Cuba secretly. Now, how does Cuba's victory over US interventions, how does it bode for anti-imperialist resistance today, almost sort of like symbolically?
Well, I think it's very, very important. I mean, the context of the time. We have a genocide in Gaza. What Israel is trying to do in Lebanon is similar. And, the Israeli-US war on Iran is basically a rehearsal of the future. This is what Colombian President Petro Gustavo said over 2 years ago. He said, what we see in Gaza is the rehearsal of the future. We see an unhinged war machine. We see the US continuing to do what it has done in the past, So colonialism is not abstract. The ability of the US to go into a country and just take its wealth, kidnap its president and his wife, is what we see. So these are issues that the Cubans, the Palestinians, the Lebanese, the Iranians stand on the front line against US imperialism, against racial capitalism, because, this is also about white supremacy. And white supremacy and racism and colonialism, as apartheid in the past in South Africa, went together with the system of global capitalism. So, for us in Southern Africa particularly, we owe a debt of gratitude to the Cubans. They played a very big role in the liberation of this part of the continent. And ever since then, they've been really selfless in supporting countries around issues of health, education, etc. So what we also see is that this affects the whole world in terms of the cost of food, of fuel, and we have nuclear weapons in the hands of the most rabid, reactionary, despicable individuals who've caused the deaths of tens of thousands, largely women and children. And this is the context we are faced with. So we have no hesitation in showing our solidarity with all the people of the countries I've mentioned, particularly Cuba. On Friday at 2 p.m. outside the US consulate, there will be a demonstration in Durban as well. And last week, Friday, there was a very successful demonstration in Cape Town.
I'm incredibly interested, and I think it's quite right how you speak about all these agents of repression, white supremacy, genocide, imperialism. All of these things are so incredibly interconnected. And so in fighting them as well, I believe that the agents of liberation also need to work in an interconnected way and mirror the international solidarity that Cuba showed to Southern Africa at our time. And this is where this protest that we're speaking about, the Cuba Solidarity Now protest, calls for a number of things like ending the blockade on Cuba and Iran. So my question is, how do these economic sieges mirror the strategies that have been used against Palestine? And, what unified actions can we take? How do the repressive agents work in a similar way? And as the agents of liberation, what is our duty?
Right, absolutely. I think, you've asked the most critical question. We need to understand that the logic and violence of this global system of racial capitalism, of colonialism, and of extraction is not confined to one place or time. The same crude oil that is extracted from the Niger Delta, the minerals from the Congo, and the coal from South Africa fuels the machinery of the US empire and the Zionist genocides. So we need to link these struggles. The fact that the UAE is supporting the rapid support forces in Sudan, and Sudan was encouraged to have normalization with Israel by Trump in his first term, is no surprise. These things are linked. And the UAE has got an alliance with Israel. In the Congo, millions of people have died for the minerals. And there's a network of warmongers which are financed and armed by the global elite. And Israel is there. So we need to connect the dots. We need to struggle to lift the blockade on Cuba as we struggle to have a boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign against genocidal Israel in the way we've had BDS against apartheid South Africa. And we need to support the people on our continent, whether they're in Congo, Sudan, or the people of Swaziland who are facing an authoritarian, undemocratic regime, but also the people of Western Sahara who are fighting for their independence from Morocco, which has also got normalization with Israel, which the US empire brokered. So what I'm saying is that for us, the struggle is one, as Samora Machel said, and we all remember that this is the fight of on different terrains, but fought by the same forces. That is the essence of solidarity, and that we need to link hands and support these struggles and get more people involved and people to understand that the US empire is not going to give in without a fight. Israel is going to continue committing a genocide, and there will be other genocides. And so it is essential for our people not to be seduced by the American empire and their apologists. They say we have unemployment because we don't have enough investment from the West. That is false. The West is only interested in plundering our continent. Jobs are created in different ways, and we don't need the West, or if they come here, they should not blackmail us.
Yeah, I agree that the United States won't give up without a fight, especially in this current administration that says the quiet part out loud. They're not even ashamed of, they don't obfuscate their unjust, immoral actions behind any sort of international law or anything. They just do it straight. So as an international community, you've already spoken about boycott, divestment, and sanctions, but how else do we take the fight to them in a way that will end up with actual serious consequences for them that will maybe make them surrender?
Yes, you're absolutely right. They are very brazen, They don't even use dog whistles any longer. Their racism is so clear, unlike under Biden and Hillary Clinton and Obama. But it's part of the same empire, the same monster. You're right. I mean, the best way is to link our struggles. So we are part of the Palestine Solidarity campaign. We have linked with the Cuba Solidarity Group. We have linked with people from Congo who are fighting against the exploitation of their country, as well as Swazi activists against the monarchy. And we have strong links with the Palestinians, grassroots organizations, and we're part of the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. We also link up with anti-racist organizations in the US, whether it's African Americans or Latinx, and indigenous people throughout the world. So this is our network, and this is our internationalism. We say that the Epstein class, as some of the people are calling them, the billionaires, are only interested in greed and profit. And we can't expect anything from them. They are our enemies. But the people of the US, the vast majority, are not our enemies. It is the ruling classes, and we need to constantly link up with them. Not too long ago, there were 8 million Americans on the street in the different cities of the US against Trump on No King's Day.
Yeah.
And similarly, there are other protests around the world. Those are the people we link up with.
Now, I believe um, or I believe that a lot of South Africans do have sympathy for the Cubans and for the Palestinians and for all these oppressed peoples. How would you encourage these people who maybe have the sympathy but haven't taken the steps to go to these protests, such as the Cuba Solidarity Now protest? How would you encourage them to get involved in amplifying this anti-blockade, anti-imperialist solidarity?
Well, we understand that our people are really struggling to survive. Many young people, the majority, are unemployed. So survival is the first thing on their mind. But we want people to understand that in our case, we have limited freedom, and that limited freedom, we have a long way to go, was only won because of international solidarity. But the other issue is that from these countries, we can understand that there are alternatives to capitalism, that many of these countries have experimented with cooperatives, with creating work not for capitalists, but for themselves collectively. So those examples we can learn from. Unfortunately, we adopted a neoliberal macroeconomic policy, and for over 30 years it has not delivered on employment, less inequality. It's deepened inequality. And we need to look for alternatives. And one of the ways we do that is to understand those different countries, their lessons, and why imperialism wants to strangle them, wants to strangle Cuba, because it sends out a different model of development, of delivering on people's needs.
Now, I do know you are running out of time and I don't want to keep you too long. I hope we'll have you on the show again, perhaps on Friday, with the protest or once more, so we can have a deeper discussion. But my final question, and thank you so much for joining me, is what's your call to action for these countries that are, facing Western economic pressures ahead of the Cuba Solidarity Now event? And how can we turn the historical memory of things like the Bay of Pigs invasion into present resistance?
Absolutely. The Bay of Pigs shows that, and history generally shows, that victory is possible. That, the powers that be, the ruling class, the rich and comfortable, the billionaires, want us to believe that we are facing overwhelming odds and it's futile to resist. And that is why they're using overwhelming, despicable, vile ways of killing people on an industrial basis, regardless of whether they are children or women or civilians, because they are desperate. And history has many examples that imperialism cannot win, that they do not offer the oppressed of the world the kind of society they want, that this empire and its billionaires are willing to sacrifice millions of particularly black and brown people and working class people generally, so that they can accumulate capital and maintain domination. And in doing that, they are putting the human species as well as nature at risk. What we see with climate catastrophe is an example of putting the interests of the billionaires in front of the interest of the people and of nature. And now we have the very real possibility of a nuclear holocaust, because they're even beginning to talk about this openly against intransigent people who refuse to live like slaves. So I think for those reasons, it is an existential issue for all of us. And it is vital that we have to resist imperialism and their apologists in our country. And we have many parties who are opportunistically capitalizing on the failure of the ANC and the government of national unity to deliver, because they cannot deliver using neoliberal ways. They have to have fundamental change. And so they are scapegoating what they call foreigners. They are being xenophobic instead of addressing the real causes of inequality and unemployment.
All right, that was Professor Salim Vally of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And I couldn't have put it better myself, right? You heard Prof. Salim speak about what an incredible injustice this is and why it's important for the international community to stand up together. That brings us to the end of our show. We spoke about this Cuban blockade and the protest against this Cuban blockade and against American imperialism generally. And this is happening on the same day as the Bay of Pigs invasions more than 60 years ago. Then we've also spoken about the significance and importance of traditional leadership in Africa and in South Africa, and a initiative that is trying to help bridge the gap between traditional leadership and modern finance frameworks. It's been a fun show. It's been an informative show. I will be back with more. But for today, I've been Seakga Tladi, and I am out of here.